Hey everyone, welcome back to another session of mine regarding some of the workflow I use for a particular kind of photography I've been experimenting with a lot. Thanks to Primes and Zooms for organizing this. So today I wanted to have a sort of a brief discussion about a question which I've gotten very often, which is why do I shoot panoramas? What is the point of shooting panoramas for landscapes? Because panoramas generally are things which you associate with very wide angle shots to increase your field of view. I don't shoot them that way. I use them in a very different way. So I had a lot of questions about people asking about why I shoot these panoramas, how I shoot these panoramas, and what are some best practices. So that's what the session is about today. And again, feel free to please ask any questions you have as we go, and I will address them at the end of the session. Any questions you have about technique, about the rationale behind why I use them, and there's a fair amount of technical stuff in this discussion. So if you have any questions about that, please put them in the comments, and I will definitely get to them by the end of the session. So can we get the presentation up on screen, please? So I put together a little presentation, and I'm also going to be doing a working session for you guys. Kapil, can I get the presentation on screen, please? Sorry, we seem to have a challenge here where the presentation is not on screen. Just give me 1 second, let me sort that out. Again, I apologize. Let me just see if I can get this working. So if we can't get that working, I have a little workaround. So let me just get that started as well, just in case. Oh, there you go. All right, thanks, Kapil. Okay, so this is a little presentation I put together regarding how the rationale and why you should think about shooting panoramas and maybe if it'll work, if it'll help you in your photography. So first of all, what are the reasons that you want to shoot a panorama, right? So beyond the obvious reason for anyone to shoot a panorama is to increase the field of view of the image. By that, I mean if you have an image which you think that you cannot capture enough of, or a scene that you cannot capture enough of in a single shot, a panorama is the option that you would use to increase the field of view of a given lens that you're using. Right? So if you have for example, if you're shooting a very wide, sweeping vista and you want to show all of it in one shot, you might want to use either a very wide angle lens, or if you don't have a wide angle lens, you can just shoot a panorama. So that's a general reason why people shoot them. So I don't shoot it for that particular reason, mostly because I don't shoot extremely wide landscapes. I don't like the appearance of very wide landscapes, and I'll get to why I don't like that. And it's of course a personal thing. It's a matter of your taste and your personal vision in photography. So these are the common reasons why people shoot it. One thing is perspective, which is increasing the field of view. The second thing is to add resolution to the scene. Image quality and noise I will get to. Aspect ratios, which is when you shoot a panorama, you can experiment with aspect ratios which are not native to your sensor. So all our DSLR cameras like this, all these cameras shoot a 3:2 aspect ratio. Now you have medium format cameras which shoot different aspect ratios. I have film cameras which shoot 6:6. But changing the aspect ratio post facto always involves a loss of something, right? You lose resolution. So if you have a 3:2 frame, which is like this, and then you want to make it a 1:1 frame, you're losing the data on the sides, so you're losing resolution. So panoramas are a good way to experiment with different aspect ratios without the loss of resolution. Another question is, should you shoot wide angle or should you shoot a panorama? And the last point that we are going to discuss today is why shoot telephoto panoramas? So a wide angle panorama is understandable because you want a field of view which is wider than a wide angle, but why would you just shoot a telephoto panorama? So I'll get to that. So before we get to why we should shoot panoramas, we should just have a brief discussion about some terms which are thrown about sort of incorrectly so that we all speak the same language. So the most important is perspective. So perspective, and I've put a very handy, helpful definition here, and we'll be sharing the presentation after the session. So perspective is basically the sense or depth of spatial relationships between objects in the photo. So by that I mean when two objects are uh, in the frame, one closer, one farther apart, what is the relationship between the size and the apparent distance between the objects, right? So if I put my fingers here, right? So you can see that this finger which is farther away looks much smaller. This finger which is closer to the frame looks much larger. So this is perspective, right? The relationships between these two objects and their sizes, even though my fingers are generally the same size. So this difference is perspective, right? So the difference between spaces and the relationships of objects in space in the frame is perspective. And there are only basically two factors at play. That is the two factors which there's actually only one factor, but we think of them as being two factors, which is the field of view, which is how wide the shot is, and the distance between you and the subjects that you're photographing. So now the main point and the main contentious point that I want to emphasize is that distance is the only factor that controls perspective. By that I mean that there's this information online which says that with a wide angle lens things look distorted, like objects look farther away. So objects only look farther away because with a wide angle lens, if you have an object which is very close to the center of the frame, then something behind will look farther away. But if you shoot the same thing with a telephoto lens, and if you shoot the same scene with a telephoto lens and you shoot the same scene with a wide angle lens and crop the wide angle lens, it will appear to be the same. It'll look exactly the same. And you can try this out. Now, this little diagram I've put on the side, this shows the same scene shot with a variety of lenses from 17 mm all the way to 600 mm. And what I want to emphasize is the only difference between the perspective of the 17 mm and the 600 mm is the field of view. Right? If you took the 17 mm frame and cropped it down to the size of the 600 mm frame, it would look the same. Of course, there's a difference in resolution and such, but that's an important thing to keep in mind. Wide angle lenses allow for a larger field of view for that given perspective, right? And the other challenge with wide angle lenses is wide angle lenses also create an unlifelike relationship between foreground and background objects. By that I mean, so currently I'm being photographed right now with a 35 mm lens. 35 mm, 50 mm, they have a reasonably good representation of the field of view and the distance between me and the background. If you shot this with a very wide angle lens, to have my head stay the same size in the frame, I'd have to be very close. I'd have to be this close. When I'm this close, the background looks farther away, right? And that's because the distance between me and the camera has changed. The perspective has not changed, right? So the distance has changed because of the distance, the perspective has changed, right? So the field of view does not affect the perspective, only the distance affects the perspective, right? And because of that, wide angle lenses can, if used improperly, can create very strange looking relationships between the size of subjects in the frame. So that's why I tend to avoid them. At least I tend to avoid strange ways of using wide angle lenses, or the common ways of using wide angle lenses I tend to avoid because they look odd to me. So, and of course, that's a personal preference. Uh, so this is just an enlarged version of that previous frame, the previous photo. So now let's get to another important point, which is resolution. So in the past, when we had lower resolution digital cameras, and I'm talking way in the past, so uh, 2009, 2010, maybe up to 2011, we only had cameras which could do consumer cameras which could do 6 megapixels, 12 megapixels. Now, even though those 12, 6, and 12 megapixels can actually produce very, very good large prints, people have been doing them for many, many years. Nowadays, you have cameras which by default, so I have a Z7, 45 megapixels. I have an A1 sitting here, so this thing will do 50 megapixels. So that's enough resolution for almost any situation. So resolution is no longer the primary motivator, at least for me, to shoot panoramas. Now, of course, there are people, I have a friend who shoots, makes extremely large, very high resolution, very high detail prints. So for him, resolution is incredibly important, so much so that 50 megapixels is not enough. But for everything that we do, everything that I do, I make 3 by 2 prints, 3 feet by 2 feet prints, 36 by 24, and 50 megapixels is fine. It's good enough. Of course, if I want to crop or do something else, it's insufficient. So resolution is not my primary motivator, and I don't think it's a primary motivator for most people. And of course, nowadays most of the viewing of images is done online. It's no longer done on a print. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality of it. And you're looking at it in on a phone screen about this size, right? So when you see a photo that size, the resolution of it doesn't really matter so much. And these days you have now it's the sort of the wild west for imaging technology. You have incredible features coming up. So there's something called pixel shift, which is in a few modern cameras now, which combines images to make a super resolution image without shooting a panorama. There's AI-based image upscaling. So this is a new feature which has come up in Photoshop, where you can use AI to upscale your image to make it twice the resolution. And it also does image reconstruction. It recreates textures based on its AI algorithm. So there's some amazing features available to increase the resolution of your image. So shooting a panorama might not be the best reason to do it. Large, high quality printing is the edge case where panoramas really shine. So unfortunately, this edge case is not something that most of us run into, right? So we'll be doing it very rarely. And even then, it's not an ideal solution. So I don't want you to think that resolution is the reason why we create panoramas. Image quality. So now this is where things get interesting and become more of a motivational factor for shooting panoramas. So shooting panoramas provides an easy way to overcome sensor limitations, dynamic range, noise, and resolution. It also gives you a very easy way to overcome sensor size limitation. So this is probably a topic left for a different discussion, but I use panoramas to simulate large sensors. So for portraiture and such, I might be able to show you a couple of examples, but I use it in that way as well. So by shooting a panorama, you can actually get a virtual large sensor. So much larger than the sensor you're shooting with right now, which is for full frame cameras, 36 by 24 millimeter sensor. Image noise is dramatically reduced. Now this is an interesting thing, and I have a little demonstration for it. Dynamic range can also be dramatically increased with HDR panoramas. And so now the next scene I'm going to show you is a couple of shots shot with an A7 III, and just ignore my cat. So I shot these one after the other. This is my computer. Now these were shot at ISO 12,800. So the image on the right is essentially a single shot made with a 24 millimeter lens. The image on the left is a panorama shot with a 58 millimeter f1.4 lens. Both are f1.4 lenses. This is a 24 1.4. This is a 58 1.4. Now, if you notice the field of view, which is the amount that you can see, is quite similar. I couldn't match it exactly because I was trying to do it quite quickly. The field of view matches reasonably well, so you can tell that you can see roughly the same amount in each photograph. You can see a bit more on top in the panorama. You can see a bit more on the side on the single shot. Both these shots were shot at ISO 12,800, so quite high. The ISO is very high. Now, because this view is quite small, you might not be able to see the noise, but this image is fairly noisy. Both these shots were shot at 12,800 ISO. I did not change any settings. I used exactly the same settings for both. I don't remember the shutter speed, but the relevant part is it was shot at f1.4. It was shot at ISO 12,800, both these photos, the panorama and this image. Out here, I know it's difficult to see, but if you see this image when we send the presentation over, there's a lot of noise here. There's a fair amount of noise here, and you can see the dynamic range, the colors have shifted. So it's a noisy image. If you look on the right, this is exactly the same ISO, but the noise is almost invisible. Now, why is that happening? That's happening because you're taking a very large resolution image and scaling it down. When a large resolution image is scaled down, the noise gets hidden. So that's a great reason to shoot a panorama. So let's say you're shooting in a situation where you think this is going to be extremely noisy, but you don't have a choice. You have to shoot it at that higher ISO. Maybe you don't have a tripod, right? Maybe that situation exists where you're in a darkish environment, you don't have a tripod. My recommendation is just shoot 4 or 5 photos. Shoot a panorama with using a slightly more telephoto lens. and combine them together, and you'll notice a dramatic reduction in the amount of noise that you have in the image. So it's an easy way to dramatically increase the image quality of your photo. Now we come to something more interesting, and this is more to do with human perception and the reason why I shoot panoramas. So this diagram represents how our human vision works. And this ties in closely, and of course, I don't think this is substantiated by any science, but this is my observation about why I think this works. Um, or I haven't delved into it deeply enough to understand the neuroscience behind this. But essentially, the human vision works in the following way. We can detect vision very far into our peripheries, and that you can tell. So you can tell if something is moving in your peripheral vision, right? Right here, like right on the edges of your peripheral vision, you can tell if something is moving. I can see my fingers moving. I don't know what it is, but I know something is moving here. When you narrow it down a little more, your color vision only exists for this range, which is the 60 degrees and 30 to 60 degrees on either side of your vision. So you can only tell color in this sort of narrow range. Shapes an even narrow range, text an even narrower range. So when you read, you only can determine text at this very narrow range of your vision in front of you, right? And why is that important? Text involves discerning fine detail, right? It involves when you read something, you concentrate on that part of it, and everything else around it is irrelevant. It fades away. What I've noticed is when I go to places, when I go to beautiful locations, when I look at a scene, I always notice the details. I notice bits and pieces of the details in the scene, which I put together later, and that forms a memory in my mind. So the shape and the color all together, they don't hit me at the same time. I notice things which catch my eye first, and then I notice the peripheral details afterwards. I think it works the same way for everyone. Given that, what I like to do is I like to deploy the maximum possible resolution and detail for the parts of the frame which are the most important for me, which I want to remember, which I want to emphasize in the photograph. So to do that, if I shoot a very wide angle frame, it might actually be a very small portion of the frame, right? The part which is important might be a very small portion of the frame. So I'm going to give you a really good example. So this is a wide angle shot I shot in Iceland of a crater. Now, when I saw this, this is not even a very wide angle photo. I think this is only shot at 20 millimeters. So it's not extremely wide. So you can see you might not be able to see, but there's a person here, and there are many people here on the hills. As I was walking by the scene, the thing which struck me is that everyone here, there were couples, there were families, there were people having conversations here. That's the thing which hit me, that these are people enjoying the same human experience that I'm having right now in this incredible place. So the place was important, but the human connection between the place and the human connection, the stories of the people here and the place itself, that actually drew me to take this photo. So then I realized that I can't see anything here. I can see stuff close, right? But the things which had an impact for me were not visible. So then I shot this image, which is a panoramic image of the same photo. Now I took a few vertical frames with a telephoto lens, with a 70-200 lens. And here you can see the individual stories being told with this beautiful texture and the sky in the backdrop. There's a couple walking here. There's a family here. I think there were two people having an argument here. So it's a beautiful story that can be told because I could deploy the tools that I had to tell the story that I wanted to tell better. And so that's why a panorama helped here, where a wide angle shot would not have worked, even though everything else would have been the same. Now the question is, could I have done it with a single shot? And the answer is no, because what I'd have to do is a single shot would be a completely different aspect ratio, right? So that's the other part of it, right? In my vision, I saw this narrow band of stories happening. So I wanted to show this aspect ratio, this wide look of the place. So that's why I shot multiple vertical panoramas and stitched them together to get this aspect ratio. These are other examples of what I said, of the things which were important to me, emphasizing them to the use of a panorama. So this is I don't have a wide angle shot of the same scene because these days I've shot these kind of scenes enough that I can pre-visualize it very well. So I know when I want to shoot a panorama and when I want to shoot a wide angle. And I do shoot a few wide angle shots as well. But in this particular case, this road, which is snaking into the hills, into these hills and mountains, This was the journey that we were going to make into Iceland. So this shot was in Iceland, and I wanted to show how the road snakes into these mountains, and the road here as well. Now, if I had shot this with a wide angle frame, this part of it, the road which is closer to me, would have looked larger, and we wouldn't have even been able to see this part of it. It would have been just a few pixels on the horizon. So instead of that, I shot a panorama. Now the reason why I haven't cropped this is, and I haven't cropped any of the preceding photos, the panorama photos. I want you to see how I shot them. So if you look here, you can see my individual frames, and you can see that I didn't do it perfectly, but I did it well enough to be able to crop into what I wanted. This is a similar scene. This is Yosemite National Park. And when I saw the scene, I have a wide angle shot of this as well somewhere. I can show it to you later. It's also on my Instagram. In the wide angle scene of this photo, the waterfall, the mountain, half dome in the background, everything looks far away and very small. The trees which are here, these dominate the scene because they're quite large and they're very close to you. And if you look back at the first slide that we had, things which are closer dominate the scene. That's how perspective works, right? So, especially with a wide angle lens. So, the panorama allowed me to get an extremely high resolution, very detailed, low noise version of the scene, which I'm eventually going to print and put up on a wall. So this is an example of shooting a panorama with a moving object, right? This horse, these are not still, not stationary objects. So you can even shoot a panorama if you get your technique correct of objects which are moving. And the emphasis of this is one, it has a very lifelike feeling to it, in the sense that it looks very much like my narrowed vision when I saw these horses. I was fascinated by them, very friendly animals. They'd come up right up to you and hope that you give them something to eat. And using a panorama, I could simulate a large format camera and get this beautiful depth of field, the fall off, and the reduced noise and the increased resolution, all these things. This is again a similar situation. A wide angle photo would have an emphasis on the stuff which is close to me, which are these rocks, which I did not really want to see in the frame. But I wanted to see this part, which is a river flowing into the mountains. So, which is why I decided to shoot a panorama here. So this is another example where I wanted to show, I have more examples of this, I'll bring this up. So I was shooting this photograph and I'll show you the wide angle photo. This is the wide angle photo of the same scene. This is also a panorama, but a much wider panorama which I shot. Right? So I wanted to notice the distinction here and how you can use it as a creative tool and as a storytelling tool. So this panorama allowed me to show this lighthouse beautifully because that is the thing which had captured my attention at that time. And the relationship between the lighthouse, the mountains, the foreground, and the background without having the distances appear to be too distorted, while also getting this field of view. Now, meanwhile, just prior to this, I had seen this scene. So this is the same lighthouse. You can see the lighthouse in the corner. I haven't cropped this yet, so you can see how many frames I shot. I think this was 15 frames. There's a person sitting here, and this person was sitting by himself near this edge of this mountain, and it's difficult to tell, but it's a very large drop. It must be at least 60 to 70. I'm guessing maybe 60 to 70 meters. And this person completely captured my imagination because I could imagine myself just sitting there and admiring this scenery in front of him. We eventually went down here later, but by the time we got here, it was too dark. So I shot this as a panorama because later you can actually see. I don't know if I have those photos. I'll try and put them up on screen. There's a photo because of the extreme resolution, the detail I got. I have a photo where you can just see him surrounded by these mountains as well. But the beauty of it is because of the nature of the panoramic image shot with a telephoto lens, even though he's such a tiny fraction of the scene, when you see this photograph, you cannot miss that there's a single individual sitting here surrounded by this. So that's why I decided to shoot it this way. And if anyone wants to see a higher resolution of this or want to see what this looks like, I will put that up on screen later. So this is similar to the first winding road photo. Again, I shot a panorama of this image. So this is interesting. So this was a very rare occurrence which had happened, which is I saw a double rainbow near the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. I think this is the Bay Bridge. And I did not have my wide angle lens available to me at that time. So this was more of a necessity that I had to shoot it this way because I didn't have a wide angle. because I've practiced shooting panoramas so often, I can just make a panorama really quickly without having to change lenses. So it saves me a lot of time. So this is the corrected version of it. And you can see the flattening of the perspective because of using a telephoto lens. And you can play with the field of view as well, the aspect ratio, to get a very wide, literally panoramic scene. Right? So these are the reasons why I shoot panoramas. Now, if there are any questions, please put them up. Otherwise, we can move ahead to techniques and considerations. Apologies, I have an allergy going on, so I'm going to keep sniffling in the live stream. So techniques and considerations, meaning how do you shoot all this, right? I showed you, I explained why I shoot all this. Now I'm going to have to talk about how I shoot all this. So does anyone have any questions before we move on? Okay, I don't think there are any questions coming up so far. So let me move on to the techniques and consideration. So one thing is, should you shoot a panorama with handheld or with a tripod? So now that's a bit of a complicated question. So let me just see if I have all of this. Yeah. So all the photographs that you've seen that I've shown you have been shot on a tripod. I did not use have been shot handheld. I did not use a tripod for any of those photos. And there's a specific reason for that, which is correcting for parallax, and I'll get to that later. The second thing is simplifying post-production. And again, this I will show you a live demo of this, correcting for parallax and camera settings. So these are the things which we're going to be talking about. So what are the optimal techniques to shoot a panorama? Now, the main thing is when you shoot a panorama, what are you trying to do? At the minimum, you need a fair amount of overlap between each frame of your panorama. So when you shoot a frame, you need the next frame to overlap the first frame so the software can make that stitch. If the stitch is very little, okay. So there are questions. I will get to those questions in a bit. So getting back to the sorry, I got sidetracked by the questions. First of all, when you're shooting, you should try to get as much overlap between two frames as possible. If you get 50%, even better. Any more than that is not very useful because you'd have to shoot a lot of photos. By that, I mean, if you got a photo, make sure you got 30% overlap to 50% overlap for the next photo, vertically as well as horizontally. Okay. And the next thing is when you shoot a panorama, you should always shoot that with the manual exposure mode. So I know I'm one of the first people to say that you should just shoot automatic, use aperture priority. But for panoramas, it's the only time I will always say that flip your camera into manual mode and shoot the whole panorama in manual mode. Now, the reason for that is if you shoot it in automatic, and I mean manual everything, manual ISO, manual aperture, manual shutter, everything has to be manual. So it has to be fixed. It has to be a fixed value. And the reason for that is because if the exposure changes from frame to frame, the panoramic software will have issues, one, stitching it together, and second, you'll see horizontal banding. And I'll show you an example where the banding, I have photos where the banding is quite poor. You can actually see the vertical lines in the frame because I forgot to switch the camera into manual mode. Why do you need manual focus? It's because if you keep refocusing every time, there might be a chance that one of your panoramic frames will be out of focus. If they're out of focus, then it just will not stitch at all, right? Or it would stitch and you'll see a patch in your photo which is out of focus. So you can either use manual focus, or in my case, I use back button. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with back button, but back button focus is when you have the focus set here. So when you have the focus set here, as soon as you take your finger off this button, the camera will not refocus. Sorry, I'll just show that again. Will my camera focus now? Yeah, okay. So this is an AF on button. My camera will only focus as long as I have this button pressed. So when I take my finger off, it doesn't refocus. So this takes care of one of the complications. If you have your autofocus set for this button, which means that every time you press the shutter button, it also focuses. Panoramas become very difficult. It becomes irritating. So what you have to do is if you use the front button, you have to flip your, so second, let me just show you. So almost all lenses have let me just show this lens. They have an AF MF switch. So you would have to remember to flip the you'd have to remember to flip the switch to manual focus and then shoot, right? And shoot the whole panorama and then remember to put it back to autofocus in case you need to shoot something with autofocus. So this is important. And remember what I mentioned about the overlap that you need. So basically, when you're shooting a panorama, you have to shoot with overlap. So you're basically doing this motion. You're actually overlapping the frame like this. So you're shooting, 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 shooting. And you know what? I will actually, at the end of this, I will do an extremely difficult panorama right here, sitting here of some random object on my desk. The challenges with panoramas are if objects are very close to the lens, it's very difficult to get a clean panorama. If objects are far away, like landscapes, that's easy. When objects are close, it becomes very difficult because your technique has to be perfect if objects are close. And that's because of parallax. And I'm going to show you why parallax is an issue in just a second. That is the greatest challenge you have to overcome as a panorama photographer, especially if you're trying to do something creative with panoramas. If you're starting out, I would recommend don't do panoramas where objects are close to you. If anything in the frame is close to you and you want that in the panorama, I would avoid it for now until you get a sense of how to handle the challenges of parallax, which I will show you techniques how to mitigate it, how to eliminate the parallax errors. But until then, the easier thing is to shoot things which are far away. Maintain rotation about the nodal point. I'm going to get to this in a second. And the hand technique to simplify post-processing. So now this is important. So when you shoot panorama, so I'm going to put this heavy camera down. I'm going to show you my little film camera, and I'm going to just use this. So when you shoot a panorama, now what are the challenges which you will face later? The primary challenge of a panorama, aside from the initial part of shooting it, is the post-production part of it, right? When you try and do the post-production part of it, maybe you shot 100, maybe you shot 1,000 photos in a trip. You come back home, and there are many similar photos which could be part of the panorama or may not be part of the panorama. So you don't know when the panorama will start. When did you start shooting the panorama, and what is the last shot of the panorama? That's difficult to find. So what I do is, this is a technique which I read many years ago online. I don't even remember who came up with this technique, but it's fantastic. So what you do is, if you know you're going to shoot a panorama, if you know you're going to be shooting a panorama, before you start shooting the panorama, put your hand in front of the frame, right? Shoot a photo of your hand, and then shoot the panorama. And when you finish shooting the panorama, put your hand in front and shoot another photo of your hand, right? So what will happen is you'll have a photo of your hand in the beginning of the sequence, and you'll have a photo of your hand at the end of the sequence. And all you have to do is tell the software to stitch all the photos between the photos of your two hands. So that is a really nice hack, and it's a very simple way of handling it. So these are all shooting considerations that you have to keep in mind, right? And please, again, if you have any questions, put them up and I will get to them. Uh, Hardware requirements. After we talk about hardware requirements, I'm going to get to the techniques that I use. So now hardware requirements. Should you shoot it handheld or on a tripod? Oh, okay. Aditya asked, is there a limitation on what shutter speeds we should use while shooting panoramas? So now this is a really good question. So now Ashwin, I see another comment asking about long exposure panoramas. We'll get to that one later. But about this one, what shutter speed should we use? The idea is that a panorama is actually way more forgiving for shutter speed than a single wide angle shot. The reason is because of a panorama, you're going to get a lot more resolution. And when you shrink that down, you won't be able to see minor shakes in the camera. But the flip side is because you're shooting a telephoto lens, you need faster shutter speeds, right? So my rule of thumb is when I shoot a panorama, I use the minimum shutter speed I can get away with for a single shot of that panorama. So for example, if I'm shooting with my 50 mm, this is a 50 mm, I will use something like 1 by 30 to 1 by 50 if I don't have a choice. Ideally, I'd want to use as fast a shutter speed as I can get away with. Right? But the good thing is nowadays with the mirrorless cameras, you have image stabilization. And I've shot a 50 mm lens like this. And if I just show you this photo here, not this one. Uh, Sorry, I just got to get the right photo. Yeah, so this photo here, you can see it was actually pretty dark. It was actually starting to get to a point where the light level was not that high. So there are frames in this shot. The frames in this shot are actually shot at fairly low shutter speed. There must be about 1 by 50. And this was shot with a something like a 7200 lens. I don't remember off the top of my head. But it's a fairly telephoto lens. So I was shooting a 200 lens at 1 by 50. And there might be a little bit of shake, but because the resolution of the final image is high, you can't notice it. Right? So you have a margin of error, but in the beginning, until you're confident about your technique, my recommendation would be take a test shot. Can you hand hold it at that shutter speed? If you can, use that setting. But the benefit is, as I demonstrated in this image here, the noise is not such a big issue, right? So you could use a higher shutter speed at a higher ISO, and you shouldn't be worried about noise because the noise will get hidden in the resolution, right? So that's a important factor. It's a good question. Thank you for asking. Okay, so hardware requirements. Now, for hardware requirements, should you use it handheld or should you use a tripod? And I'm going to give you, it's not a simple answer, but I'm going to tell you the pluses and minuses of both. Everything I've shot so far, which you've seen, has been handheld. There have been a couple of situations, such as astrophotography, where you definitely need a tripod. There's no way around it. So that case is a different case. I'm talking about the images which I just showed you. So the challenge is, if you're using a normal tripod, so this is a regular tripod here, right? This is a standard tripod. I'm going to mount a camera onto this tripod. I don't have the tripod, of course. I'm just showing it to you on a tripod head, right? So this is a camera on a tripod head. Can we get a full screen, please? I'm just going to back up here so you can see it. Now just imagine my hand is the tripod. So when you're shooting the panorama, you're going to be shooting it like this, right? And up and down based on how you want to do it. Now, the problem with this is fine as long as everything is relatively far away from you. If the subject is near infinity, this is fine, this works fine. The challenge starts to happen if there's something close to you, because what's happening is the camera is not rotating around what's called the nodal point of the lens. It's rotating around this axis. You can see where the tripod head is meeting the bottom of the camera. So it's rotating around this axis here, right? It's not rotating around the nodal point of the lens. And that introduces something called a parallax error. And I'm just going to show you a parallax error right now. So you'll be able to see it. So I'm relatively close to this camera. Okay, so should be able to rotate this. Okay. Now, behind me, you can see a vertical line behind my head, right here, this line, right? Just watch that line. See where that line is intersecting the top of my head, right? I'll just put a handy, helpful finger here. So you can see my finger and that line are aligned. When I rotate the camera, you can see the alignment goes wrong. My finger is now to the left. Now my finger is now to the right of that line in the background. I hope I hope that's visible. I know it's not a great example, but you can see that the relationship between where my hand is, where my head is, and the background is changing, right? And why is that changing? It's changing because the camera is on a tripod. This camera here is on a tripod, and it's rotating around this axis. So I'll just show that to you here. It's rotating around. Will it focus? Come on, focus. It's rotating around this axis, right? So that creates what's called a parallax error. When you have a parallax error, it's obvious, right? Because the relationship between me and the background is changing, it won't stitch, right? The software cannot merge those two photos. It's very difficult for it to merge. So we need to figure out a way around that. We need to figure out a solution where that stitch will happen, that the merge will happen. So that method is called a nodal rail. This is a nodal rail. A nodal rail allows you to put the camera and align the camera around the nodal point of a lens. So what's the nodal point of a lens? The nodal point of the lens is the point of the lens. Every lens has what's called a nodal point. Okay. So there's a point in the lens itself, in the physical dimensions of the lens, where if you rotate around it, there will be no parallax. So you won't have parallax. Now, how you determine nodal rail, there's a method. You can see lots of methods online to determine the nodal point of a lens. But the rule of thumb is if you look inside your lens and you can see the aperture blades, the nodal point is somewhere near the aperture blades, right? So if you, for example, in this lens, let me see if I can show you the aperture blades. Focus. Yeah, I think you can see the aperture blades, right? Sort of, right? So they're about here. This is physically located here. So if I rotate and pivot the camera about this point, there will be no parallax. There will be no parallax error, right? So this is called the nodal point of the lens. Now, you get something like a nodal rail. Couple, can you pull up um, the presentation, please? So you get a nodal rail. What this does is it allows you to fix the camera. It allows you to take the camera and clamp it in such a way that the rotation, the transition rotation, whatever you're doing, will only happen about the nodal point of the lens. Right? So this is how you get a shot without parallax error. And this is the only way to shoot a panorama when an object is close. Otherwise, it just will not stitch. You can try it, it won't happen. Right? Now, do you need one of these things? Is the question. My answer is yes, if you're going to be doing something complicated, if you're using this for real estate where it has to be perfect, it has to be perfect, it has to be accurate. But if you're doing it for something like landscapes where mobility is more important, where you have to be quick and you have to get the shot quickly or you have to be mobile, you're not going to be carrying all this stuff along. Most people will not think about carrying this stuff along. So then the question is, okay, I don't have a nodal rail. How do I shoot a panorama where something is close? And so the answer is really simple. It's a really simple hack. So I'm just going to use a lighter camera because that other camera is a bit heavy and difficult to manage. So what you do is, I'll just show you the aperture for this as well. Right, so you can see the aperture blades here. So they're physically located here near this ring. So what I do is when I shoot the panorama, I put my finger underneath the camera like this, right? And then I don't keep my eye next to the viewfinder anymore because I need space for the rotation of the camera. Right? So what I do is I keep my finger here. I look through the viewfinder once. I get focus. I make sure my settings are fine. And nowadays you have live view, so you can just look at the back of the camera. While my finger is here, I just rotate, shoot, rotate, shoot, rotate, shoot, rotate, shoot, rotate, shoot, like this. Right? So this is how I do it. And this is a poor man's pano rail. There's a poor man's panoramic head or nodal rail, so to speak. So this is the practice that you need to do to get around the challenge of having parallax error. Kapil, can you put the presentation back on? And I'm just going to show you another diagram I have for parallax error. Right, so this is an example of a lens which is not being rotated around the nodal point. So when you rotate it around, oh, this is being rotated around the nodal point, sorry. So when you rotate a lens around the nodal point, you can see that the relationship between the red dot and the blue dot do not change. So this is why you do it, right? These alignments don't change when you rotate around the nodal point. And you can see he's doing, in this diagram, they're basically doing this. They're basically putting a pivot point near the front of the lens where the aperture blade is and pivoting around it. To do this technically correctly, with a nodal rail, you would actually have to calibrate and find out exactly where that aperture is. What I am doing is guessing. I'm getting a very good guess because I know where the blades are and I'm assuming the nodal point is at the blades. There is a minor difference and it may not be at those points, but it's close enough that you can actually shoot a panorama without any fear, right? So that's an important aspect of it. Um, Pano head. So this we just talked about a pano head. So do you need a nodal rail or a pano head? The answer is if you're going to be doing extremely critical work, I would say yes, get one. If you're going to be doing it very often, yes, get one. Otherwise, just don't do it. Do it handheld or figure out a way to do it without a nodal head. Storage consideration. So this is the other little irritation that you'll face when you're shooting panoramas, which is that you need a lot of storage. Right? You need a colossal amount of storage to process this, and especially Uh, I use high resolution cameras, so each photo is 40 MB at least. And this is a problem which is going to be ongoing. Even the entry level cameras now will be 40, 50 megapixels soon, 40, 50 megabytes per file. My panoramas sometimes go into 200 shots a panorama. So that's 240. You're looking at 800 megabytes just for one shot. It's almost a gigabyte for a shot. So these are problems, yes, but store I don't see it as being a big challenge because storage is cheap. But what you might need to do is buy more SD cards to make this work, right? So now coming to the last part of this, which is the post-processing and the tools. So there are basically three tools which I know, which I've used in the past, which can do these things. So the post-processing and tools are Lightroom, Microsoft, and AutoPano Giga. Now I used Lightroom and I used AutoPano and Microsoft ICE, which is image compositing editor or something of that sort. Yeah, image composite editor. I used these extensively in the past to stitch my panoramas. Now I don't use these anymore. I just use Lightroom. What's happening is Lightroom is basically becoming like a superset for all sorts of odd photography features that someone might want. So Lightroom can now do HDR inside Lightroom. It can do a panorama inside Lightroom. It can do an HDR panorama inside Lightroom. And the best part about it is that unlike Microsoft ICE and AutoPano Giga, most photographers will already have a license for Lightroom, so you don't have to pay extra for software. And the second thing is it spits out a DNG file, a raw file. So it takes all your raw files, it puts them together and gives you another raw file. The benefit of that is your workflow does not change. You don't have to get a JPEG file and hope that you got the white balance right. You get a raw file that you can edit just like any other raw file. Right? So that's basically the end of the presentation. Now I'm going to just show you I'm just going to share a window where I'm going to show you a demo basically of how this works. Before I get to the demo, are there any questions? So there's Ashwin's question, which I will get to in a second. Meanwhile, let me just share my Lightroom window. Okay, let me just hide all this and everything else. Okay, so let's get to Ashwin's question first. How does one plan telephoto panoramas with long exposures? Challenges with moving clouds and water. So water is not that much of a problem. So what would happen is with you will ev so if you shoot a long exposure with water, the water starts to smoothen out, right? If it smoothens out enough, you won't have a problem stitching it. It looks fairly natural. The problem is if you do telephoto panoramas with faster shutter speeds, then it becomes more problematic. So in my experience, if you try doing long exposure panoramas, and by long exposure, I don't mean 1 or 2 seconds, I mean 30 seconds. If you do long exposure panoramas, everything evens out by itself. So excuse me, sorry, these allergies are really bothering me. You could do a 30-second panorama of clouds moving. And what tends to happen is that because the cloud's movement is it's fluid. It's like a fluid moving through the air. So when it does that, the motion tends to smooth out any sort of jittery imperfections. So when you stitch the panorama, it actually aligns pretty well. It doesn't look unnatural. So you can try it out and it'll be fine. The challenge is what happens if there are fast moving objects in the frame and you're shooting at fast shutter speeds. That is way more challenging. In that case, what happens is you have to make sure that you capture the fast moving object first in one frame and then let it go. After that, you finish the rest of the panorama. So then the object will appear in that one frame of the panorama and not appear in the rest. Otherwise, what will happen is if you capture the same object multiple times in your shot. So, for example, a good scenario would be a plane moving across the sky and you're shooting a panorama of the sky. If you shoot the plane, you wait, you shoot another shot, and the plane is in the frame again, then it'll appear multiple times in the panorama, and then you'd have to go out and clone it, which is irritating. So there's fast-moving objects, that's more challenging. The slow-moving stuff, try it out, it actually evens out, it smoothens out really nicely. You won't notice it. Um, okay, so let's go to a live demo. Are there any other questions? So first of all, I'm going to show you, where's that photo? Where's that panorama? So if you recall in the presentation, I'd done a panorama of my PC. So these are the files I used. I'm just going to go over them one by one. So this is, one second, I'm just going to show you. One second, I'm just going to pull up the panorama so that we can see them. Oh, okay, so these are the two shots which I used in the demonstration earlier. So the right side is shot with, you can see that is shot with the 24 mm lens. The left side, this one is shot with, uh, it doesn't have the XF, but it's shot with a 58 mm lens, and I shot a panorama. Right, so the field of view is somewhat similar. So I'm just going to show you how I shot this. Now this is a very challenging case. If you notice, I'm very close to the computer. I'm hardly 6 inches away from the computer. But there's only one minor mistake which I made, which is here, right? The rest of it is actually stitched pretty well. All the vertical lines are looking vertical. There are no jagged edges. Now I did that using the technique I mentioned earlier. So you can see how I shot it. It's shot in manual exposure. You can see that the XF, I don't know if you can see the settings on top, but it's 1:640 ISO 12800. Now, ignore these settings. I shot it at ISO 12800 to demonstrate that the ISO performance improves if you shoot a panorama. So you can see how I shot it. You can see the overlap here, right? So that generates this panorama. And you can see the incredible resolution that you get out of it. So this has become a 255 megapixel panorama, which I shot very casually. Now I'll just show you the stitch itself. So these are all the files that I used, starting from number 33 onwards. So how do you do this in Lightroom? Super simple. You take the file, you select the last file. I didn't use the hand technique here because these are the only photos I was shooting. But ideally, you should have a hand in front and a hand afterwards. You right click on it, go to photo merge, go to panorama. It takes a while. This is the computer I'm using is extremely powerful, so it actually happens pretty quickly. So this is the preview of the panorama that it will generate. And you can see that's pretty much exactly the same result we got. All I have to do is hit merge and it'll create the panorama. Let me show you another example of it. And this is a more complicated example of it. So this is a panorama that I shot. This is a relatively smaller panorama, but I was trying, so this has that element of moving things in it. Right? So this one I shot, and this is the final result here. Right? So this is shot with these many photos. Now I used a lot of overlap here because I was trying to reduce the impact of noise in the image as well. So I was trying to do a few different things. I could have done it with many less, but you can notice here that each frame of it is actually a bracketed exposure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I shot bracketed exposures of all of these things and combine them into an HDR panorama. So I can select all these images. So the 27 images, there should be more. I don't know if that's right or not, but let's just try. It should actually only be 25 images, but Lightroom has an option of something called an HDR panorama. So it combines the HDR capability with the panorama capability to create what I call a super resolution image. So it creates an image which has much more dynamic range, much more detail, and has the benefit of having all the other advantages of a panorama. So this is of course even more CPU intensive. So if you have a slower computer, you can actually queue these up. With Lightroom, you can actually batch them together and tell it to combine 10 or 15 images and just leave it overnight. and it'll by the time you wake up in the morning, it'll all be done. Of course, the challenge is if you shot it incorrectly, then you will find out only an hour, a few hours later that you did it wrong. And you can see even on this computer, even with just 25 or 26 files, it's taking a long time. So I'm going to cancel it. It'll take a while to do it, but the end result is you get something like this. Right? So it's a beautifully detailed image, and it has an incredible amount of dynamic range. So I'm just going to reset the image so you see what the original is like. And by dynamic range, I mean you have extremely beautiful highlight roll-off up here. And you have extremely beautiful, you have a lot of shadow detail here. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a panorama, but you can't see any errors in the water, which is moving. It's moving water, of course, but you cannot see any mistakes in the moving water, right? So the fast moving water, the random nature of the fast moving water makes it merge pretty well. But if you had something like a car moving, it would be pretty difficult to do. Right? So this is how you would actually stitch something like this together. And a lot of the stuff I've done, I'll just show you some more examples. So you can see some more examples of shooting panoramas here. Right? So this is a panorama with long exposure. You can see that nothing's happened to the clouds because they sort of blend in each exposure. Um, right? So you get beautiful detail. This is a 162 megapixel panorama. Shot it with exactly the same techniques I mentioned before. And there's several examples. I can just keep going. There are like endless examples where I keep shooting with this kind of image. So you can see beautiful examples of this. 100, and you can see all the texture detail that you get out of it. So these make for beautiful. The intention for shooting this was to make a very large print, of course, not applicable to everyone. But yeah, so this is basically all the techniques I used. And if you recall, I mentioned earlier the photo of this individual, the person right here. So this is what I meant. And you can zoom in further. So you can even see this one lone fellow contemplating his existence. Right, so that's basically the presentation. So Kapil asks, why do I see the error unable to merge these photos when stitching in Lightroom? Yes, so you also got the right answer. So there's not enough overlap in your images. So you need to have at least a 30% overlap in your images. If you don't get that 30% overlap, it just won't work. Uh, and also parallax errors. So two things, the lack of overlap, and the second thing is extreme parallax errors. So if you get close, like I said, if you get close, you have to use the technique which I mentioned. You have to do this, right? And if you guys are all interested, I can just show you an example of it right now. So what I'm going to do is I'll just do a live demo of it right now, okay? So I'm shooting with this camera, right? I'm going to shoot a photo of the camera which is shooting, right? So it's very close to me. So that means that there is going to be a parallax error if I do it wrong. So I'm only going to do 4 shots which I do incorrectly, and I'm going to do 4 shots which I do correctly. Okay, so first let me just get the photo, right? See if I can get that right. Think this will work. Okay, so now I'm going to do it incorrectly. Incorrectly would be rotating around the tripod head, which is how we would do it with a tripod. Right? And you will see me do it right. So the first 4 shots, I'm going to do it incorrectly. It might work, it might not, because the challenge here is that this is a very let me just stop down the lens so we get some more depth of field here. All right, let's try it. So this is the incorrect way of doing it. Okay, so that's the wrong way of doing it. Now I'm going to try and do it the right way. The right way is the nodal point is here. I'll just do this quickly. Okay, so that's the right way of doing it. So let's see what stitches and what doesn't. Both might stitch, mostly because there's nothing behind the camera, so there's no parallax error visible. It's still there, but it's not visible. But let's try. So I've got this. Let me just import these photos in. 1 second. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second because this import process takes a very long. It's very irritating. So let me just hide that for a second. Okay, so let me just share it again. Okay, here we go. Now you notice I made one mistake, which is I didn't use my hand. So I don't know where the second set of panoramas starts. So which is a bit of a mistake on my part, but I'm pretty sure the first 9 are the bad way and the rest, these are the right way. So simply put, I'm just going to select these guys. So here's a nice pro tip as people, as the kids say these days. So to save time, what you can do is you can select the first batch, right click. You can say create a stack, group into stack. Do the same thing for this. Select both these stacks, and I think the shortcut is Control M. Excuse me. So when you hit Control M, it does it in the background. You don't get that interface. You don't see the pop-up which says that this is the panorama and this is what's going to be the end result. You just have to trust that you did it correctly. Right? So when you think your technique is right, it should just work. Now, unfortunately, there's going to be a bit of a wait. I didn't shoot too many photos, but I realized I shot it with I shot it with my A1. So these are 50 megapixel files each. So this is going to take maybe a couple of minutes to stitch. Okay, so first one is done. Which worked surprisingly well, given that I didn't pay much attention to the parallax, but you can see a problem here. Let's see if the next one will work better. And I apologize for the allergy. Oh God, this is terrible. Again, it's almost done. Now, just keep in mind, we are working with one of the most powerful computers that you can get for something like this. But even then, it's going to slow to a crawl processing this much data. Okay. So this is the one I did correctly, I think. So you can just compare them. The right side one is the one which I did correctly. The left side one is the one which I did incorrectly, I think. But both of them seem to have worked fine. We'll only know when you check them a little closer. You'll notice the parallax errors happening in these areas where things overlap. But surprisingly, it seems to have worked. Not the demonstration which I wanted to do, but you can see that with the right technique, uh, I was hoping that one would fail, but it didn't. Maybe the nodal point of this lens is a lot closer to the back of the lens than the front, so it removes most of the parallax errors. But please remember that this is not normal. This actually goes wrong. This is one of those weird demos where I wanted something to go wrong and it didn't. Right? This should have actually gone wrong, but it didn't. It worked fine. So this is basically, you can see that in a few seconds I've created on a 230 megapixel panorama, which just stitched perfectly. Right? So you crop this and you get a good image. So are there any other questions about this, guys, before we wind down the presentation? I know it's been a long one as well. I didn't expect it to go on for 1 hour. Excuse me. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions, so we can. I think we can wind this down. We'll share the presentation with you later. All right, thank you, everyone.